Yes, I just want to really start by making the obvious point that how important Saudi Arabia is to the UAE. If you look going back in past, even recent history, in the mid 2000s, and also that the war took place less than 3 months after the succession of King Salman and the appointment of MBS as Minister of Defence. A complete change of direction from the rather lackadaisical policies of the Abdullah era. I think MBZ, the UAE, saw this as an opportunity for the UAE to use Saudi power and influence for its aims in the region, and obviously hope to influence Saudi policy. They had a shared concern with Iran, and initially at least a shared concern over the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood of Islam. And clearly there was a very, very good rapport at the beginning, but really the problems have emerged, were, I think, also there from the beginning linked to their own military policies and their roles in Yemen. Clearly, the UAE focuses on the south and the coastal areas, with Saudi Arabia on the main battlefronts, and both pursued the war through supporting Yemeni forces, but in quite different ways. Saudis were really obliged to work with President Hadi, the Yemeni army, and Ali Mohsen in trying to rebuild the army and fight that war, and using sea and air power to support the army. And part of that was because of the influence of Islam. Politically and militarily, inevitably this involved support for Islam. The UAE, on the other hand, in the very early phases, deployed its own forces and then used this experience in other conflicts, mostly in alliance with the US, to identify local forces it could trust, train, pay, equip, and mentor. And this in fact became eventually the security belt forces that proved effective in driving the Houthis out of the south and then taking on AQAP and restoring enough security in Aden to allow the Hadi government to return. Of course, the UAE then went on to Shabwa and Hadramaut, recruiting elite forces, rather different from the SDC, but recognizing the special case there. And no doubt mindful of the Islah and Yemeni military influences in northern Hadramaut and Shabwa, and went on to push Al Qaeda out of Maqalla. But the UAE in Aden had found the Hadi regime ineffective. It lacked supports in key parts of the south, was unable to deliver effective government, and for UAE purposes was too close to Islam. I think the UAE more or less foisted Idris al-Zubaydi on Hadi as governor of Aden. He proved to be too independent-minded, was sacked, and that eventually led to the creation of the SDC, very clearly with UAE support. I mean, I was talking to the SDC leaders around this time, and they went to Riyadh where they saw nobody at all, they could see nobody important, and the message they were given was go back and fight the Houthis and come back after it's all over and discuss southern independence. But they went to Abu Dhabi where, of course, they were supported. The UAE, from that time onwards, if not before, was paying the expenses of the SDC organization. And of course, for quite a long time, was also paying the expenses, the salaries and costs of the security belt and elite forces, and indeed local government officials in parts of the south. The UAE was also responsible for the operations on the west coast and the planned capture of Hodeida. And part of that involved what is now the National Resistance Forces, led by Tariq Saleh, which again the UAE trained, paid, and supported from Mocha. And the real turning point was the decision not to proceed with the attack on Hodeida, coming just at the time of the Khashoggi problems, and also as the criticism of Saudi Arabia in the West of the way the war was being conducted rose to some crescendo, and there was shortly after that one saw an apparent warning, perhaps directed towards the UAE, of Iranian influence in unexplained attacks on shipping off the UAE coast. In response to all this, the UAE withdrew most of its forces in 2019, but continued to support the SDC and militias. in 2019, the SDC rose and took over Aden, and then, of course, tried to move into Shabwa, but were turned back by the Yemeni army. And the UAE attacked the Yemeni army as it was trying to return to Aden, a very clear indication that, of the degree of UAE support for the SDC. As a result of the Riyadh agreement, there's no UAE troops in Aden, and then the Saudis there in small number, and increasingly acting as a sort of mediator, apparently understanding the strength of the SDC that they've come to appreciate. This obviously all led to strains between the relationship between MBZ and the MBS, but I think they had enough common interest in the region as a whole, and for the time, the boycott of Qatar and other issues. They were fairly determined not to allow differences between them over Yemen to interfere with that relationship. And there's very clear evidence of friction at working level. Currently, the UAE remains part of the coalition. UAE aircraft are still bombing, as far as I know. It apparently supports the Riyadh agreement, at least it says so. Those actions would suggest otherwise. But just make the point here, which is partly made by Jerry at the end, there's this tends to be an assumption outside that Yemeni clients do what their patrons want. In fact, Yemeni clients demonstrate fairly consistently they do what the Yemeni clients, what their external clients want, remarkably stubborn when their vital interests are at stake. So the UAE is continuing to support the ST financially, and it is certainly mentoring and apparently continuing to provide arms to the security belt and elite forces. It has a limited troops presence close to about half, Akana in Shabwa, and Makalla, I think for CT purposes, it appears to have a limited presence on the west coast. It seems to be developing an airstrip and other facilities on Periam Island, Mayoun Island, close to Bab al-Mandab. And of course, it's been interested in Socotra from the outset. I'm never totally clear why. Like it probably sees it as a useful strategic presence for monitoring shipping and naval movements, and perhaps would also want to deny others influence and access there. The UAE was there, but in effect has facilitated the STC takeover of Ireland. There's a small Saudi group presence, but again, they seem to act more like a referee or mediator than an attempt to influence or control. The current military role of the UAE seems to be consistent with a strategy that suggests that the UAE wants to influence political, military, and potentially commercial developments along the coastal regions, using its clients, the STC, and potentially the North Resistance Forces, and part of that will be the protection of the Bab al-Mandab, which their current troop, they see what's going on Periam Island would suggest is an aim. But the other question I was asked, what is the UAE's ultimate commitment to the STC? My guess is this is purely pragmatic. It's a useful organization at the moment. The UAE is not going to say it is opposed to Southern independence, though it's actually never publicly supported it. The SDC remains a dominant power in and around Aden, which in terms of the south is where the population is concentrated, and it's influential along the coast and on Socotra. Finally, on Al-Mahra, the UAE were there until 2017, mid-2017, but pulled out because of strong local resistance to its attempts to create a security belt elite force model there. I think the UAE simply became just too unpopular in Mahra, and there was, I think, a deal at the time in late 2017 for the Saudis to take over. And of course, the Saudis have deployed there in considerable numbers, in greater numbers than the other part of the south, ostensibly to cover smuggling, which was certainly true. Smuggling was a serious problem at the time, but that presence hasn't really diminished and remains there. And the signs are the Saudis have no early intention of leaving. I shall stop there.